Since those days, he's been promoted as what is called in Australia a public intellectual, with access to the media. What struck me about his remarkable 10-page attack on Burchett was how vividly it demonstrated how the gatekeepers of the Australian elite have never really recovered from the Cold War virus that brain damaged so much of our political and cultural life and that still sets the boundaries of political debate in this country. Will the Monthly now publish in full the demolition of man's attack by 5 distinguished Australian authors, including professors from Melbourne, ANU and Yale? If you'd like to read this, by the way, go to Online Opinion on the web. Again, the question begs, what's to be done? Well, let's celebrate those who break the silence, the honourable exceptions. One of my favourites, the Chaser, whose imagination and courage shamed those who remained silent while Sydney was taken over by Howard and Bush and the police during the APEC conference last year. And let's ask some questions. Let's examine the Prime Minister's literary awards. These are meant to recognise, and I quote, the major contribution of Australian literature to the nation's cultural and intellectual life. No, they don't. Dangling a tax-free prize of $100,000, they serve to pacify our cultural and intellectual life. All the titles on the current shortlist of 15 are as safe as houses, including a book on Napoleon. Only 4 of the publishers are Australian, and none of the authors need the money. What a message to send out to young writers. Speaking as a journalist, I believe we need a public movement that monitors, deconstructs, and counters the corporate media. In every university, in every media college, in every newsroom, teachers of journalism and journalists themselves need to ask themselves about the part they play in the misinformation and disinformation that allows great power to have its bloody way. Such a counter-movement within the media could herald a perestroika of a kind we've not known, as the internet has already demonstrated. And the public will be part of it, learning how to decode the news and demand the truth. But we need to make haste. Liberal democracy is moving towards a form of corporate dictatorship. This is an historic shift, and the media and compliant and silent writers must not be allowed to be its facade. If those of us who are meant to keep the record straight and tell the truth and break silences fail to do this, then who will? That great whistleblower, Tom Paine, warned that if the majority of the people were denied the truth and the ideas of truth, it was time to storm what he called the Bastille of words. That time is now. Thank you.
Thanks, John. What we'll do now is we'll open it up for question and answers from the floor. But just before we do that, I would like just to have a question of my own, John. You opened your comments up with some humorous kind of retelling of your early days as a journalist, which for me, spoke very true of perhaps the media experience today. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how much it has changed, say, over the last 30 or 40 years. Was this an issue that you think was prevalent? The things you talked about, were they prevalent when you were a young journalist? Are they worse? And if so, why?
Yes, they were prevalent. I mean, I got my cadetship on probably the most reactionary newspaper on earth, the Daily Telegraph, then owned by Sir Frank Packer. there was limited choice. I think choice in Australia really ran out before the Second World War, when the small town editor or the independent editor, who then spawned independent journalists, became obsolete. Australia once had, per head of population, more independent newspapers and therefore journalists than any other English-speaking country in the world. But I think what's made it different now is that we do live in a media society in which we're told that we get a great deal of information all the time, when in fact what we do is we get a great deal of media and we get a great deal of repetitive information. And the restriction in the number of, or the contraction rather, of the number of corporations actually dispensing this has been very dramatic. I mean, off the top of my head, it's gone worldwide from major corporations, from something like 80 in 25 years ago, to really, of the really major corporations, a handful. Rupert Murdoch says there will be 3, and his will be one of them. So when you put that fact together with the power of technology, I think, although the essence of it was the same when I started, but the application of it now is indeed much more worrying and troubling.
Okay. Questions? There are some volunteers going around with microphones. So put your hand up and the volunteers will find you. Up the back.
Yes. I agree with you about a lot of things. There's certain things I don't agree with you about. One time I found myself disagreeing with you was you wrote an article on the peace process in Cambodia, and Gareth Evans was pushing that at the time. You didn't like the idea of including the Khmer Rouge in that peace process because, well, I'm not going to speak for you, but I thought you thought it was a very bad idea. Since then, I think the country's probably not in an ideal situation, but it's certainly in a better situation than it was, and the Khmer Rouge have pretty much crumbled in the wake of the peace process. I think, again, I don't want to speak for you, but I think you didn't like the idea of dealing with groups that were as repulsive as the Khmer Rouge and including them in processes. But when you've got people with power who are repulsive and you can't really get anywhere without involving them, it doesn't seem like there's many very good options. Now, for instance, the situation in Zimbabwe at the moment with Mugabe, obviously some kind of military intervention would be absurd. The process that might work of negotiating with him and the people in charge and trying to create some kind of... I would ask you to
actually get to the question if you could.
Okay, my question is, what do you think should happen in Zimbabwe? What would you like to see happen?
Hang on. We're gone from... Where are you?
Right over there.
Oh, okay. Thanks for the question. I objected to the Khmer Rouge being included in the peace process because the Khmer Rouge were being used by those who were running the peace process and who had indeed trained the Khmer Rouge, such as the British Special Forces and the Australian government at one point, by proxy, was supporting the coalition which the Khmer Rouge dominated. So the subtext to that, as far as great power was concerned, was that the Khmer Rouge were a useful tool with which to punish Vietnam. I don't disagree with, of course, with enemies talking to each other. I think it's a bit much stretching it to call Robert Mugabe's lot to compare it with the Khmer Rouge, in spite of all the horrible things he's done. There's no comparison. Yes, well, the discussions actually are going on at the moment between between Mugabe and Tsvangirai, representing the movement for democratic change. So there is quite hopeful movement, but I think, again, we've all got to watch who's being left out of this. Well, Morgan Tsvangirai's outfit isn't perfect and doesn't necessarily represent the majority of the people, although it got the anti-Mugabe vote. There is beginning in Zimbabwe, which has a great tradition of trade union organisation, something of an opposition to a deal just being sewn up between the pair of them. So it's a little bit more complicated in the way it's being reported of bad Mugabe versus good Tsvangirai. So yes, of course I would agree with negotiations. I agree with negotiations all the time because I've seen too many, I've seen the other side of it, and there's too much of war to have anything but contempt for that.
Okay, I think the next question is down the front here.
You mentioned the food blockade of the Gaza Strip, and it's a huge question about how Western governments should deal with the Palestinians. I wonder if you could make a comment on that.
Well, justice. Justice. This is dealing with the Palestinians is the way we want to deal with ourselves. The same basic rights of having a safe and decent way of life and a right to what's left of Palestine. And that basic issue exists in Palestine in spite of the terrible distortion in the way Palestine is regarded, often in the media. I don't think amongst most people. I think things have changed considerably there. The Palestinians have suffered so much because there hasn't been, referring to that other gentleman's question, there hasn't been an honest or, let's say, even self-serving office of brokerage. There hasn't been a UN. The UN have been scared off by the great power. The United States is firmly on one side, supplying one side, and looking for somebody on the other side to sign off a dreadful occupation, as it does with Abbas. And that's what's lacking. But, although it's gone on for a long time, I've been to Palestine too many times not to have faith, if you like, respect certainly, in the resilience of the Palestinian people, and I'm sure from that over, I hope within my lifetime, and I didn't call the end of apartheid, I didn't think that would end in my lifetime. I think the justice for the Palestinians is the most pressing issue of our time. Nelson Mandela called it the greatest moral issue of our time, and he got it spot on. But it's the most pressing one as well, because if you took away that injustice, then the Middle East starts to calm down, one by one. Not entirely, it's a very complex region, but that is the canker there. So I can't offer any optimism about it at the moment, but certainly the problem should be identified as such.
Okay, I think we've got a question up the back here. Yep. The gentleman in the hat first, I think. Just grab the microphone, please.
I'd like to ask your opinion on the situation visitors, publishers, agents and writers in this country, even though I'm from New Zealand. Point being, the point I'm making is this. From what I understand and what I've found myself, you can make a submission on a manuscript, and if they like it, you'll hear from them. But 85% of these manuscripts are rejected, and you hear nothing from them. Would you like to talk about the sort of covert censorship in the publishing industry in Australia? Thank you.
I don't think I would only have I'm really not equipped to answer that authoritatively. I'd have a view of it, and I'm not sure to be all that well informed. It's certainly true